Welcome to the April 22nd Eclipse OpenJ9 community call. As always, we ask that that attendees add their name and affiliation to the agenda, just so we know who's on the call. And this week, we're going to start things off first by opening up for questions. So if there's anybody who has any particularly community-oriented questions that they want to kick things off with, now would be a good time. And if not, we'll let Keith start with his lightning talk on debug symbols. So I'll just pause here for a moment. All right, then Keith, are you ready to give your lightning talk then?
Yeah, I might just need a little bit of guidance about how to share my screen with everybody.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing. At the bottom of the WebEx thing, there is a little sort of the third button. There's the microphone, the camera, and then there's a share content button. If you click that, you should be able to select the application that you want to share.
Sorry, which button?
It says share content. It looks kind of like a box with an arrow pointing up.
Oh, yeah, okay, that one. It only is a lot. Only has the choices sharing, recording or sharing. Okay, after the system preferences changed here. And let's see. And which setting do I need to change here?
I think if you're on Catalina, it might ask you to go up and add WebEx as a thing you can.
Okay.
Run
So if I click the box next to WebEx to share, I have to restart it. So I guess you'll give me a second to do that.
All right. Well, Keith is doing that. Why don't we take a look at the recent user raised issues, and we can come back to the lightning talk when he's able to rejoin. So if we look at what's been opened, there's a new one on the OpenJDK macOS and AIX quarterly builds. Have too much content, so.
Okay, I'm back, and yeah, this looks easier. Just there's a share button for the window I want to share. All right. So can everybody see?
Yeah, we can see it. Thanks.
That's the last slide. We want to start at the beginning. So I want to talk today about the debugging story for OpenJ9, particularly code that's part of the VM or native code in some module that ships as part of the JDK. And I'll start by sort of giving an overview about how the VM gets built. How does symbolic information get included? How does it flow through the process? But we don't want to overload the JDK archive that users download. So where does the information go? How do we get it back and put it back together so that you have a world where you can debug the problem that you're focusing on? So everybody's familiar probably with the -G option to compilers. Most compilers use -G, and so we do the same kind of thing. And so here's just an example of a fragment of a command line that we would use to compile one of the source files. The intent here is just to show you the pattern, and we're using Linux as an example here. So all of the source files get compiled with -G, and then we link things together into shared libraries and executables. And the linker understands -G as well, which says it should retain all that debugging information, and it gets assembled into the shared library, again using the VM as an example. But all that debugging information takes up a lot of space. In general, each object file has debugging information that may not relate at all to the debugging information in any other object file. Just because there's a class called foo in one object in one source file doesn't mean it's the same thing as foo in any other source file. Of course, that's not commonly the case, and so there's a lot of repetition. And when you assemble all this together, it yields a shared library or an executable that's much larger than it needs to be to just run it. And as I said before, users aren't fond of having to download twice as much as what they really need. So we have to have a way to, avoid bloating things for them, but still, keeping the door open for debugging problems if they arise. And so what happens, we take that example shared library again, and on Linux there's a tool called Object Copy that extracts the debug information out of it and puts it in a separate file. And we use it again to take the debug information out of the shared library. And then and this debug link tells a debugger like GDB, if you're trying to debug this particular shared library, is there a file, the name of the file that might help if it's available to add back that debugging information. Okay, so we set the stage for having smaller shared libraries, but the ability to still debug things if that information is around. So we've got it all set up nicely. And so we've added to the OpenJDK, our mirror, if you will, of the OpenJDK repos. We've added to it the ability to create this debug image. And what it does is it copies all of those debug info files into, and I've collapsed the directory name. So inside the build directory, there's an images directory, and we create a new directory under there called debug image. And the structure under that mirrors that of uninstalled JDK. Okay, and so the JVM, and so the debug information goes in the same place. The goal of that is kind of captured in the next command. So if you have a JDK, sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. This is, so we put all those object files into the folder, and then we package that up as an archive that you'll see in CI builds, right? And so here's some Linux build, and you'll see there's a link to the test images that's been there for a while, and a relatively new addition is the debug image at the bottom. And so that's a link to that archive that we just produced on the previous screen. In build.adopt, the name is slightly different, and there's an issue to see what we should do about reducing the potential confusion here. So the debug image here doesn't have a dash in its name like it did on the previous screen, but it's got the same, essentially the same content. So whichever build you've got, you find the corresponding debug image, and you've got the two of them. So I've used curl as an example of how to get the JDK, and you've unpacked it somewhere, and you've got that debug image. And this example assumes that you've downloaded it from ci.eclipse.org, the OpenJ9 instance, because like I said, it has a different structure. And so if you go into the JDK directory, the root of the JDK, and unpack the debug image right over top of it, it puts all those debug info files in the right places, So the result is a JDK that can be debugged. If you got your debug image from the Adopt website, of course, the name of the archive is different. It doesn't have the dash in it, but it also has an extra layer of structure. So we have to strip out that top level debug, the top level directory, so that things land in the same place. But otherwise, this is the same as what we just did for the CI Eclipse website. And a final adjustment, if we're talking about a Java 8 JDK, the debug image is meant to overlay the JRE. If you apply it at the top, you'll likely break your JDK, so you have to put it into the JRE directory. And so now you're all set. You use GDB, you pointed out your core file, perhaps, if you've got that, and you're on your way. GDB will find the debug info files next to the .so files, and use that the debug link that's in the SO to make that connection, and you should be able to have symbols for all the functions, so you get a nice stack trace. You should have type information so you can print objects symbolically, and everything works just like you would hope. So I talked about all of this in the context of Linux and GCC. Other platforms, of course, are different. AIX doesn't have something equivalent to object copy. So what we do on that platform is just have a full copy of the .so before we strip it. And we do some twisting when we create the debug image archive. The debug info files get renamed as they go in the archive, so they have the original name. So the debug image for AIX would have a bunch of the .so files, and so when you unpack it, they just replace the existing .so file with the one that includes all the debugging information that we want. On OSX, the equivalent to object copy is dsymutil, and that creates a directory with some structure that corresponds to each. There's one directory for each shared library, and those things all get packed up into the debug image, and when you go with the OSX debugger. On Windows, things are even simpler. We compile and link with /debug, and that produces the normal PDB files that get assembled into the debug image. And so when you unpack it, normal debugging process happens on Windows. So I mentioned the inconsistency in the name of the archive. So there's an issue open to work to remove that difference. And also mentioned the extra directory in the archive that is in one place but not the other. There isn't an issue yet, but I should raise one soon. And good. So anybody have any questions?
Good talk, Keith. I really enjoyed that. I guess are there some lingering issues at the Adopt OpenJDK builds? I think I saw an issue about lingering dsym files and so on, padding some of our release binaries. Is that also something that is getting fixed quickly? Yeah, so the person who raised that on Slack, I invited them to open an issue. It seems that they didn't do that, so I just opened the issue at Adopt this morning. You'll see a link to that on Slack. Yeah, so the intent here is to keep the JDK archives small, and so it's just a bug that they contain
DSIM folders or whatever. And so we'll work to fix that. And I think in some cases, the debug image archive is just absent in some builds. As I was trying to put together, the snapshot for this talk, I thought that the debug image was supposed to appear at adopt kind of on the same page where you would see a test archive, the test image archive. And I thought that I did for some platforms, but I didn't find it for Linux, which is what I was focusing on. So yes, there's some lingering details that hopefully we'll sort out shortly. And so we'll get to the goal of small JDKs for people to download, but still things that can be debugged if need be.
Very cool. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Keith? All right, then thanks, Keith, for presenting that today and all the work that you and others involved in this have put into making the OpenJ9 builds more debuggable.
You're welcome.
So I will pull the agenda back up. And we will continue through our regular agenda. Up next week, we have Sue lined up to give a site design review. And I have been talking with Daryl recently about a lightning talk on the new AArch64 early access build that's part of the 0.20 release. Daryl, I don't know if you're on the call, but if you are and there's a week that you'd like to give this talk and can schedule yourself into that would be good. Otherwise, I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, probably a couple of weeks. I guess the one after Sue's. So what is that, May 5th?
May 6th.
6th?
Perfect. I will pull up the user raised issues. We'll take a quick look through here if there's anything that needs to be called out as something that needs discussion today. Of the three most recent ones, this is related. The first one, builds have too much content, is related to the debug images, the talk Keith just gave. The second one is around container awareness on Windows for Windows-based containers. And the third one has been a discussion with a user around issues with locking. And it looks like it's due to an implementation difference. Hotspot implements something called structured locking, which is optional in the JVM spec, and we do not. And the rest of these, I believe, we've covered in previous calls. So just in the interest of time, unless there's any of these that somebody desperately wants to have a conversation now, we'll jump back to the agenda. Andrew, are you on the call and have you had a chance to update the download stats? Andrew, you're on mute.
Sorry, my microphone just went a bit funny. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I have updated them. Trends continuing. We still don't have the new tracking yet at Adopt. So we're working on that.
All right. Then in terms of our releases, the 0.20 release is out the door. So thank you to everyone involved in that. There is an update to that release being done on Mac OS to support the notarization of the OS X builds. And as as we're doing that build already, we're including an update to the OpenSSL library as well to address CVEs in that library. Those CVEs don't affect the functions that we call from OpenJ9. So they don't actually affect OpenJ9, but rather than shipping a library with known CVEs, we've chosen to update the OpenSSL that we bundle with Mac platform and the Windows platform to ensure that there's anyone picking those up and scanning those binaries will find the libraries we're shipping are CVE free. So in terms of that release though, it would be good to take a moment now and just record any retrospective comments that people have on what went well, what didn't go well, what we should try and do differently next time.
Yeah, there's a long list forming in the adopt issue that I have down under the regular adopt update, some of it relating to possibly release managers needing to see a better view of all of the builds involved in a release. So I think some of this can be addressed by process, some of it by updates to tools. But I think if you look in the adopt update, I've added Stuart's summary of what's to follow. And you've mentioned those updates to the OpenSSL. We've talked a bit about the notarization update that will come in a follow-up release. Some of this could not have been queued up in the initial release last week, but some of it was a matter of not seeing that things had not run correctly. So the Windows rebuild with the make sure the installers were signed, that's something that happened during the release but wasn't spotted. So we need to address those things in upcoming releases. It doesn't seem like it's a tough thing to address, but it's a good learning lesson. From the OpenJ9 side, there probably are some specific items as well in preparation for the adopt builds, but I'll leave other people to comment on those.
Shelley, does anyone else have comments that they want to call out on this release or to mention on this release? Things that we should look at doing differently next time to make sure the process goes more smoothly?
I do want to say something because retrospective should also talk about what went well. I think the EA release of the AArch64 in general went well. The build is available off the website. The testing that the dev team did prior and the removal of any failing tests to make it easier to triage those happened ahead of time. So that was all, I think, a good example of prep work that helped the release go smoothly.
Agreed. And just adding on to that, even the late changes that we put in for AArch64, the process of putting those in and making sure that they weren't going to affect the stability of any other platform went really well. We were able to do that without introducing regressions through those changes. So props to the people involved in that. Now, the one other thing is we have gotten in this habit of very late breaking changes for our releases. Even with having moved up the code split date, we're still finding a lot of the milestone items are going in late. So I continue to be a focus and an early focus on things in our milestone plans and trying to burn those lists down rather than having things sort of drop in at the last minute.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you had requested that those take priority, that activity of cleaning up and not carrying over, trying not to carry over things from milestone to milestone before putting new features in plan. I don't know how aggressively we're sticking to that, but I think it's a good idea before we create too much technical debt.
Agreed that we do need to continue to prioritize that and make sure that those items are getting closed out.
I had another question. Sorry, this isn't really a retrospective topic, but I had a question related to the. So I know for the AR64 release, we had a number of tests that got disabled while the problems are being addressed. Is there a convention or a process around how we realize that it's time to turn those tests back on? Is it they're documented in the issue that was raised around the issue around the problem that caused the test to be disabled, and therefore
I'll answer part of that. So in OpenJ9, there's actually a label that says test excluded. However, there's also an open issue in the OpenJDK tests repo. The reason I enforce that people use a full link to a GitHub issue that disables tests or that's related to it is so that we can automate that. So I have an open issue to automate looking up whether the GitHub issue is closed. If it's closed, we want to re-include the test, or at least retry the test and see if it can be re-included.
Okay.
I'll find the issue relating to this. On that note,
it's breadcrumbs.
Yeah, on that note, yeah, and on that note, I'll say that at Adopt, I've created a disabled tests job where I go and look at the set. But we also, with every test run that is run, if you look in the console output, we do a listing of what's been disabled as well.
Okay. All right. So there is a breadcrumb established back to the issue at OpenJ9 that resulted in the test being disabled at Adopt.
That's correct. Some issues might link to not OpenJ9, but to infrastructure issues,
Sure.
but they all link to some live GitHub issue.
Understood. Excellent. Good. Thank you.
So, please continue to think of things that should be addressed, and feel free to add them into this item throughout the week. No reason that this only can be filled in now. So I am going to pull up the 021 milestone now. I'd just like to take a look at, we have 48 open issues or open items in this milestone plan. Some of these are PRs, some of these are issues, some of them may be discussion items, but it's worthwhile for us to continually focus on this and focus on bringing down this list of issues so that we've cleaned this up before we're getting close to the release date. So just a reminder to the committers and contributors that this is the place that things that are going to make the 021 release should be linked to. So when you're opening items, committers, please add them to the milestone plan if they need to be included in this release. And if you're looking for something that should be picked up, please focus on this list first. And the code split date that we're targeting right now for 021 is June 1st. So we've got a bit of time, but still something we should be focused on, bringing that list down. Shelley, was there other things you wanted to call out in the regular adopt update?
Not really. Just to say thanks, Keith, for the talk, and thanks, Lan, to adding support for those debug images in our testing side to fetch them, to handle the double naming that should get fixed shortly, and the finding Java C in the correct spot now that we have kind of more than one that gets pulled down. What this means is if you were running tests locally, using the instructions that are in the OpenJ9 wiki, that will automatically fetch the debug and native test images for you, and put them unpack them into the right spots. That's it, though.
All right. In terms of machine updates and the infrastructure, Adam or Joe?
This is Joe. So we have some OpenSSL 1G, which are actually in progress for Windows. We actually have the binaries installed on the machines for each of the OpenSSL releases. For the other platforms, Jdk 14 editions is in progress. Then we also have an issue that Raj and I just started tackling. We're going to be upgrading 2 of each platform for X, P, and Z throughout the course of this week. We'll be upgrading it to Ubuntu 18. Any of those, I think the OpenSSL ones, I'll go through PRs, so we won't be broadcasting in Slack. But as far as the Ubuntu 18 upgrades, we'll be, excuse me, when the machines get migrated, we'll be, there is a PR for it, but it's not an OpenJ9 PR, so people won't be necessarily aware of it. But we'll comment that in the Slack channel to say when the machines have been migrated over, in the event that there's triage issues or test failures in particular on those platforms.
If you're in the process of doing upgrades, have you considered going to 2004, which is due out any day now?
No, we were asked through, I believe it was Alex. He wanted Ubuntu 18 for some specific, Pete would know this better, but I believe it's some concurrent scavenger type work.
It's Ubuntu 18 or later, so using 2004 would be fine, but I guess we haven't tried it yet. We don't even know if it works.
Well, we can upgrade them to 18 and then do the jump from 18 to 20, assuming that works.
Yeah, that should be fine.
18 would be like the lowest machine level that we support. So it's probably good to have a machine at the lowest level.
Yep.
I guess the only other activity, there's been a bit of a decrease there in our Artifactory usage. Adam submitted a PR because I guess we had some inconsistencies across the number of builds we would keep in Jenkins and the number of artifacts for that build we would keep in Artifactory. So those are now in sync. And with the PR that is mentioned here, 9250. After that, we have now, the disk usage is down to about 87%, which is 10% drop from our last call. So we'll, of course, continue to monitor that.
That's great to see that we're down.
Right. And I have one other thing, but that's covered in the any other business.
I don't see Sue on the call, so I think we'll skip over the website update. In terms of any other business, Devin, did you want to mention anything new or any follow-up on the CMake migration that was discussed last week?
Yeah, so I ended up having to spend some time to refactor all this split debug info support, moved a lot more of the functionality down into the OMR layer and tried to kind of generalize it. So We don't have it enabled at the moment for like the Jenkins builds for OS X CMakes, but there is a PR open on that, and the PR testing on that, which builds the OS X stuff, is passing. I ran some more of the extended tests on an internal build with those changes, and I got a couple errors which I've fixed and trying to rerun those tests now, but I'm hitting some machine failure problems I need to dig into, but I'm reasonably confident that those are also fixed and the full nightly test suite passes there. And now it's just a matter of kind of working on some documentation changes to prep for enabling that by default on OS X.
Have there been further discussion in the issue around any other concerns being raised?
There was a couple in terms of documentation and the split debug info thing. And I've got the split debug info is waiting to get merged, and the documentation I have a draft PR, but obviously not merging it yet because it is not accurate yet.
Okay. All right, so just reminder to everybody that, you know, if there are concerns or there are things you want discussed around the CMake migration, please chime in on either that issue or now. So Mark, do you want to take the next item?
Yeah, sure. So we've been having, a few of us, some discussions around whether it would be a good idea for OpenJ9 to introduce a more frequent release cycle than the quarterly release cycle that we're currently kind of inheriting from how OpenJDK works, as a way to deliver critical fixes more quickly and potentially also delivering features more quickly into our release stream. So right now everything is in terms of update releases, we're releasing things quarterly. The proposal is one idea, which would be to introduce monthly releases, and I called them interim monthly releases because I was envisioning, at least in the proposal as written, that these interim releases would be based upon the previous quarterly release. So they'd be a way for us to deliver fixes, basically, for problems that are encountered kind of mid-release, as a way to deliver fixes to people who are suffering from them more quickly. So that's kind of the basic idea. So in the proposal, I have a kind of a straw person proposal that I put in there using our April release, which we just did, as a 0.20.0 release. We could then have a 0.20.1 release in May, which would be based on 0.20.0 with critical fixes. And then in June, we'd have a 0.20.2. And then in July, we would have the usual 0.21 release, which would be the full quarterly update from our master branch. And then 0.21.1 in August, which would be based upon 0.21. So essentially you get two, the proposal is for 2 monthly releases performed on the previous quarterly release. It's not a perfect model because the September and March releases get a bit tricky, since we're also doing a release in those months for the latest JDK level. And obviously, you know, anytime you do something more frequently, it's going to be more work for people to figure out what goes into it and to manage the release branches and to, you know, branch and tag and create releases, etc. The CI work to be able to test it and so on. Obviously, you know, Adopt OpenJDK would need to also agree to follow the same release cadence if we were to want to do this. So I think really it's a proposal for something that really needs to be jointly agreed to by OpenJ9 and Adopt OpenJDK. But before specifically reaching out to Adopt OpenJDK, I thought it would be worthwhile having a discussion first at OpenJ9 to see, is this a direction that we're really interested in pursuing? And if we come to an agreement that it is something that we would like to do, then we can start the discussion with Adopt OpenJDK on how that might work and whether or not Adopt OpenJDK can help us with that particular approach. Now, what I've described in the issue is just one proposal. It's one idea. There are obviously some alternatives that we could also, we could also do. We could just do a standard continuous monthly release where you get, new dev work and fixes as well. Or we could do releases on demand if we have a critical fix that we think we want to put into to do an interim release on. But I think those approaches have some disadvantages compared to just the regular every month we put something out which has whatever is in it that we think should be in it. So that's kind of where I sat on the proposal. I've summarized it in the issue that's linked on the page that Dan's showing right now. And I guess I'd like to invite everyone to discuss it probably in the issue rather than here, especially since we're running late on time. But please do add your comments to the issue. Any users, I don't think we have any users on the call right now, but if anybody listens to this after the fact and has ideas or input to provide, please do so. And I am hoping to bring this topic back to the community meeting next week, and I'll update on what's been said and what's been hashed out, and we'll see whether that's the right time to pull the trigger on a decision on whether we move forward or not, depending on what the state of the discussion's at. Are there any questions on that just while I'm here?
Yeah, I've certainly always thought this was a good idea and a good way to go for OpenJ9. So in principle, I would support it. I would hope that Adopt OpenJDK wouldn't object once you bring it to them. So yeah, looks good. The only other thing I'd say is this may be something that's worth, if we haven't already done so, putting it out in the OpenJ9 Twitter account to get the feeling from a few more users that you might have not otherwise get.
Yep, that's a very good idea. Thank you. We'll do that.
Yeah, I can tweet that out today.
Cool. Thanks, Dan.
Cheers.
And then I guess if everyone would be nice enough to retweet that so that we can maximize our exposure to the issue, get as much feedback as possible on it, that would be great. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Mark. There are two other items on our any other business. Joe, I'm going to assume you put the next one on.
Yes, we did. That is so. In previous calls, we've decided not to proceed with cutting over our compiles for PPCLE from Ubuntu 16 to Sense 7 because we didn't have anyone there that would be able to reboot the hardware if we had some problems. That case has changed. If there are problems, we have the ability to get someone in there. It might not be within half an hour. It might take a couple hours, but we can get someone in there to reboot hardware if we have a problem. So I would like to proceed with that particular PR.
Sounds good to me.
Obviously makes it consistent with what we're doing at Adopt OpenJDK, so absolutely we should be doing that.
Yeah, what was blocking us was we had some instability with our Power 9 at UNB, and we were a little bit worried about, well, we've made some changes because we found out what that instability was, but previously, whenever we touched that particular, the host, it caused problems for all the images on there. And we didn't want to, when we had those problems, we had someone on site to reboot the box for us, so it bailed us out. But UNB has since closed their doors. Well, for a while they had a no access policy. That has since been adjusted. So we can get someone in there now. And that's why we hadn't made any of those changes, because we didn't want to lose that host. So that situation has now been, I won't say 100% alleviated, but we can get people on site if there are problems.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to proceed now. The release is out the door, so we're not worried about that. A little bit of delay to get somebody on site is completely acceptable. So
Okay.
Moving forward has my support as well.
I'll get Violetta to rebase that PR, and yeah, we can go forward with that then. Great, thank you.
Sophia, are you on the call? Or?
I've added that there. She's not here today, but I've put her in the list of upcoming lightning talks. She created a build JDK action that builds OpenJ9, 8, 11, and 14 at the moment on for X Linux, and it hooks in. We can hook it into our run Aqua action, so you can actually use GitHub Actions now to run testing through GitHub Actions if you want. So we'll do a talk to show people how that's done. We're also putting together some example workflow files so people could take those and use them. We can probably also open an issue at OpenJ9 at some point about whether we should have a default set of workflow files in the repo.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, so I guess we can work together offline to get that scheduled.
Yeah. It'll likely just come right behind Daryl's talks the week after that, but I'll double check with availability.
All right. Is there any other business people want to discuss today? Then thank you everyone for attending and bearing with us as we went past our usual half an hour. And thank you for the discussion and thoughts, everyone. And we'll talk again on this call next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.